Have you ever heard of a man born on a small island, mocked for his accent, shunned by nobility, and yet rose to crown himself emperor of one of the greatest nations on earth? This isn't fiction. It's the story of Napoleon Bonaparte, a man who rewrote destiny, who marched across continents with thunder in his boots and fire in his heart. From the ashes of revolution to the throne of France, and from unimaginable power to tragic exile, his life is not just a history lesson. It's a storm of ambition, betrayal, war, and willpower. If you think you know Napoleon, think again. Because this is not the tale of a conqueror. This is the rise and fall of a man who dared to reshape the world in his image. Welcome back to my channel, where forgotten legends breathe again. In today's powerful episode, we uncover the unbelievable, emotional, and world-changing journey of Napoleon Bonaparte, the island-born outsider who defied kingdoms, shattered empires, and crowned himself Emperor of France. His life was a storm, brilliant, brutal, and breathtaking. So, if you're ready to dive deep into the soul of a soldier turned sovereign, you're in the right place. Backhand index pointing right, don't forget to like, share, and comment your thoughts below. Subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a moment of history reborn. In the windswept Mediterranean island of Corsica, in the modest town of Ajaccio, a child was born beneath the shadow of war and conquest, yet destined to write his name louder than any general before him. Napoleon Bonaparte, born on August 15, 1769, arrived into a world already shifting beneath his cradle. Just months before, France had seized Corsica from the hands of Genoa, and though Napoleon would grow up under the French tricolor, his family's heart still beat to the rhythm of Corsican resistance. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, an educated lawyer of minor nobility, tried to secure favor with the new French rulers to elevate the family status, while his mother, Letizia Ramolino, was forged from stronger steel, a woman of stern devotion and silent power, who would raise her children amid hunger, ambition, and God. Napoleon, the second of 8 surviving siblings, was sharp-eyed and thin, unremarkable in stature, yet inwardly aflame with pride and promise. From an early age, he felt torn between identities, a Corsican by blood, yet a French subject by necessity, and this fracture would follow him like a ghost throughout his life. At just 9 years old, he left his island home, accompanied by the sea's whispers and his mother's distant prayers, to enter the Royal Military School of Brienne in France. There, he was mocked for his accent, his name, his stubborn silence. The little Corsican, they called him, a foreigner among aristocrats. But Napoleon did not break. He buried every insult deep inside and answered humiliation with obsession. He buried himself in books, history, strategy, mathematics, clinging to the victories of Alexander the Great, Hannibal, and Caesar as if they were personal instructions. At Brienne, and later at the prestigious École Militaire in Paris, he excelled not by charm or family name, but by sheer force of intellect. By the age of 16, he became a second lieutenant of artillery in the French army, a young officer with no money, few allies, but a mind sharper than any sword in the ranks. The years that followed were filled with frustration. France, staggering under debt and division, was on the verge of collapse. While noble officers dined and dueled, Napoleon wandered streets where bread riots turned violent and revolution whispered in every alley. The French Revolution, erupting in 1789, did not just shake France, it cracked open a world of possibility. Nobility crumbled, monarchs trembled, and suddenly, birth no longer guaranteed power. For men like Napoleon, the revolution was both a nightmare and an invitation. Though he believed in order more than chaos, in strength more than slogans, he saw opportunity in the upheaval. But opportunity rarely came freely. For years, he wandered the edges of power, assigned to minor posts, dismissed, recalled, exiled to Corsica, and finally forced to flee his own homeland after political divisions made him an enemy. Back in France, impoverished and disgraced, he lived in a small Parisian apartment with his brother, eating little, writing feverishly, and waiting, always waiting, for the right crack in history's wall. That crack came in 1793, when the strategic port of Toulon rose in rebellion against the revolutionary government and allowed British forces to occupy it. Napoleon, then just a captain, proposed a plan so bold, so calculated, that few senior officers even understood it: a siege tactic to retake Toulon by positioning artillery on high ground. His plan was accepted, reluctantly, and when it succeeded, driving out the British and reclaiming the city, Napoleon was promoted to brigadier general at the age of 24. Overnight, his name echoed through the corridors of power. He was no longer the forgotten Corsican. He was the architect of victory, and he would not wait in shadows again. But France, still bleeding from royal executions and foreign wars, was ruled by the Directory, a fragile five-man leadership riddled with corruption and fear. In 1795, Paris erupted in revolt again, and Napoleon, now known for his quick tactical mind, was summoned to crush the insurrection. Armed with cannons and unflinching resolve, he ordered the infamous whiff of grape shot that shattered the rebellion and painted the streets of Paris red. It was brutal. It was decisive. It was exactly what the Directory wanted. He was rewarded with command of the Army of the Interior, then quickly reassigned to lead the Army of Italy, a battered, starving force low on morale and lower on hope. Most men would have refused. Napoleon did not. He marched into Italy not as a general, but as a prophet of possibility. In less than a year, through lightning-fast maneuvers and stunning victories at Lodi, Arcole, and Rivoli, he turned a ragged army into legends. He negotiated peace with Austria on behalf of France, without permission, and returned to Paris not just a hero, but a sensation. Crowds gathered to see him. Newspapers exaggerated his genius. Women whispered his name. Politicians began to fear him. But Napoleon, ever calculating, smiled politely and looked east. In 1798, he launched the Egyptian campaign, not just to strike at Britain's trade routes, but to carve a legacy deeper than battles, a legacy like Caesar, like Alexander. He took scientists, artists, and historians with him, hoping to conquer not only land but history itself. He won early battles like the Battle of the Pyramids, but his navy was destroyed by Admiral Nelson at Abu Qir Bay, stranding him in Egypt. Yet even surrounded by sand, disease, and dwindling support, Napoleon still maneuvered like a magician. News of political instability in France reached him, and without hesitation, he slipped past the British blockade and returned home, leaving his army behind. France, by then, was ripe for another change. The Directory had lost public trust, the economy was in crisis, and enemies circled like vultures. Napoleon, only 30 years old, returned as a god among mortals. On November 9, 1799, through a bloodless coup known as the 18th Brumaire, Napoleon dissolved the failing Directory and established the consulate, naming himself First Consul, not king, not dictator, but the singular center of power in France. He claimed it was temporary. He claimed it was for the people. But in truth, he had seized what every monarch before him had coveted: complete control, born not from bloodlines, but brilliance. In 3 decades, the little boy from Corsica, who once spoke no French, who was mocked by nobles and almost erased by history, had become the most powerful man in the nation that once considered him foreign. He had risen not by fate, but by fire. And though the crown had not yet touched his head, the world had already begun to tremble under his name. When the dawn of the 19th century broke over France, it did not rise gently. It exploded, carried on the back of a young man who had already broken every law of fate. Napoleon Bonaparte, barely in his 30s, was no longer simply a general or a revolutionary hero. He was First Consul, the sovereign breath at the heart of the consulate, ruling France in name of the people, but with the authority of an emperor-in-waiting. The revolution had shattered crowns, slaughtered kings, and made liberty an altar drenched in blood, but in its wake, chaos had bloomed like a weed. France, exhausted by years of violence, inflation, and war, no longer craved ideals. It craved order, victory, and stability. And Napoleon, with his iron mind and velvet hand, promised them all. He rewrote laws in candlelit chambers with jurists and philosophers, birthing what would become the Napoleonic Code, a legal legacy that would outlive empires. He centralized education, modernized administration, reformed taxes, and tamed religion by signing the Concordat of 1801 with the Pope, not out of piety, but as a masterstroke of political engineering, bringing the church back under state control while calming a nation that still wept at the memory of guillotined bishops. But though he built like a statesman, he never ceased to march like a general. In 1800, as Austria reared its head again, Napoleon left Paris cloaked in secrecy and crossed the Alps through the Great St. Bernard Pass, a feat as poetic as it was military. His army, though lean and frostbitten, descended into Italy like thunder, and on the fields of Marengo, France once again tasted victory. It was not the biggest battle of his life, but it was one of the most symbolic. It reaffirmed his legend, silenced his enemies, and made clear to Europe that Bonaparte was not a passing shadow, but the rising sun. In Paris, his popularity surged beyond measure, but so too did whispers of ambition. He denied any desire for monarchy, but every act betrayed him. Portraits began to mirror ancient Roman emperors. Artists painted him with laurel wreaths, not revolutionary sashes. Coins bore his profile like Caesar reborn. Behind closed doors, he worked tirelessly to control not just politics, but perception. Newspapers were muzzled, critics vanished, and spies bled through the salons of Paris. Yet the people, worn by famine, terror, and uncertainty, embraced the calm of his rule, even as it drifted toward dictatorship. In 1802, a referendum declared him consul for life, a title that rung with the echo of kingship, and though it passed with suspiciously high support, the public did not flinch. They wanted victory. They wanted glory. They wanted France to be feared again, and Napoleon was delivering. In the countryside, peasants praised the return of law. In cities, merchants flourished under the stability he engineered. Abroad, however, the world bristled. Britain, ever mistrustful of French ambition, watched Napoleon's expansionist moves with growing unease. Though peace had been signed in Amiens, it was fragile, more a breath than a promise. Napoleon annexed territories, meddled in foreign thrones, and acted not as a servant of peace, but as a sculptor of empire. To his enemies, he was becoming precisely what the Revolution had sought to destroy, a monarch cloaked in merit. But to his supporters, he was something greater than a king, a self-made sovereign, untethered by bloodlines, forged by war, intellect, and unshakable will. And so, in 1804, the transformation was complete. Having survived assassination attempts, defeated conspiracies, and neutered the remnants of royalist and republican resistance alike, Napoleon moved toward the inevitable coronation. Yet he would not be crowned like those before him. There would be no bowing to the Pope, no kneeling before tradition. In a grand and theatrical ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, under the frescoed ceilings and watchful eyes of Europe's elite, Napoleon crowned himself, lifting the laurel-wrapped golden crown from the Pope's hands and placing it on his own head. It was more than defiance, it was declaration. He was not born of divine right. He was not chosen by lineage or God. He had seized the world with bare hands, written his own myth, and now stood above every monarch who had once mocked the name Bonaparte. As he turned to crown Josephine, his empress, the ceremony became complete. Not just a union of lovers, but of symbols. He had taken France from the storm of revolution and placed it beneath the wings of an empire, shaped not in Versailles, but in battlefields, not in royal cradles, but in ambition. And though many would accuse him of betrayal, of murdering the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, Napoleon believed he had fulfilled them in a new form. For the people no longer ruled France, but through him, they were victorious. He was their sword, their lawgiver, their myth. And from this point forward, the world would no longer look at France and see a republic. It would see an empire, and at its center, a man who once crossed snowy mountains with nothing but a map and a dream, and who now stood beneath cathedral domes as Napoleon I, Emperor of the French. In the aftermath of his coronation, As the cathedral bells of Notre Dame still echoed across the stones of Paris, Napoleon Bonaparte stood not as a monarch born of divine right, but as a sovereign self-made, sculpted by fire, revolution, and war, and with his crown resting not by permission but by conquest, he set his gaze upon all of Europe. The year 1805 would be the beginning of his transformation from emperor to legend, from ruler of France to master of empires. As the nations of Europe, Britain, Austria, Russia, formed yet another coalition to crush what they saw as France's monstrous rebirth of tyranny, Napoleon moved with the precision of a predator. He struck not with overwhelming size, but with speed, cunning, and impossible daring. Marching his Grande Armée from the banks of the Rhine, he crossed into enemy territory and delivered one of history's most stunning blows at the Battle of Austerlitz, the Battle of the Three Emperors, where he shattered the Russian and Austrian forces in a single day of blinding strategy. Beneath a wintry sun, through fog-draped fields and frozen blood, he crushed the old world order. The Holy Roman Empire, a 1,000-year relic, collapsed in the shadow of his boots. He redrew the map of Europe like a god with a quill, toppling thrones and planting brothers and loyal marshals on the skeletons of ancient kingdoms. Joseph became king of Naples, then Spain. Louis ruled Holland. Murat took the crown of Naples after him. But Napoleon didn't just conquer lands. He restructured them, breathing laws into them from the Napoleonic Code, building bridges and schools, erasing feudal rot, even as his armies marched with steel in their hands. His empire was not just French, it was Napoleonic, and it spread from the Atlantic to the gates of Moscow, each victory a brick in the monument of his myth. But glory came at a price, and already the cracks had begun to whisper beneath the thunder of victory. In 1806, at Jena and Auerstadt, Napoleon humiliated the mighty Prussians and marched into Berlin like Caesar returning to Rome, but his shadow grew longer with every parade. Britain, ever unyielding across the Channel, ruled the seas after Nelson's triumph at Trafalgar, leaving Napoleon's empire landlocked and vulnerable to strangulation. His response was the continental system, a massive economic blockade meant to suffocate Britain by cutting it off from European markets, but it was a gamble rooted in arrogance. Trade slowed, economies faltered, and resentment brewed in lands that once cheered him as a liberator. Meanwhile, in 1807, Napoleon turned east again, striking down Russia at Friedland and forcing Tsar Alexander I into the Treaty of Tilsit, a temporary handshake between wolves. On a raft in the middle of the Niemen River, they divided Europe like chess masters, but behind Alexander's smile lay fear, and behind Napoleon's lay fate. He had reached the summit of his power, crowned not just by France, but by fear and awe across the continent. But even mountains crack at the top. In 1808, he made a fatal miscalculation, invading Spain, a land of fire, faith, and stubborn blood. He deposed its king and placed his brother Joseph on the throne, believing the people would accept progress as easily as they did parades. But Spain did not bow. Instead, it bled. A brutal guerrilla war erupted, feeding on civilian rage, ambushes, and British support under Wellington, turning what should have been a swift political move into a 5-year bleeding wound. Napoleon called it the Spanish ulcer, but he underestimated its poison. While his generals struggled in Iberia, resentment brewed at home. France was no longer the revolution's promised land. It was an empire of conscription, of taxes, of endless war. Yet Napoleon pushed forward, as if momentum itself could hold back fate. In 1809, Austria rose once again, hoping the emperor had lost his edge. At Wagram, Napoleon defeated them again, but the cost was higher, the victory heavier. Gone was the nimble genius of Marengo. Now came the heavy foot of empire, grinding forward with brute strength. That same year, in a chilling symbol of personal sacrifice, Napoleon divorced Josephine, the woman who had waded through his campaigns, who had held his heart through Egypt and Italy, because she could not bear him a son. He loved her still, but he married Marie-Louise of Austria, a teenage princess of the same house he had humiliated, seeking to tie his empire to bloodlines, to legitimacy, to a dynasty. The irony was bitter. The man who rose against kings now sought to breed one. And in 1811, a son was born, the King of Rome, the child meant to carry his legacy beyond the grave. For a moment, everything he had built seemed invincible. But behind the gold, behind the columns and cannons and coronations, the world began to change. The fragile alliances he had forged by sword were rotting from within. Russia, chafing under the continental system, resumed trade with Britain. Austria and Prussia watched, bruised but breathing. Spain remained in flames. And Napoleon, obsessed with domination, saw betrayal in every corner. So he did what emperors do when threatened. He prepared for war, on a scale the world had never seen. By 1812, he commanded the largest army in European history, over 600,000 men, a multinational colossus of French, Italians, Poles, Germans, and more, and marched toward Russia to punish its defiance. It was a march that would turn glory into gravestone. But that comes next. For now, in the brief breath before disaster, Napoleon stood at the absolute summit of human ambition. He had reshaped Europe, redefined empire, and bent kings and countries to his will. And yet, within him, somewhere between the cheers and the silence, he must have felt it, that the mountain he climbed had no place left to go but down. In 1812, with the sun blazing over Paris and the drums of empire still echoing across Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte stood as the most powerful man alive, a sovereign forged not in silk but in cannon fire, ruling a vast dominion that stretched from the shores of Portugal to the edge of Poland, with his crown secured by force and legend. But greatness, when overfed, becomes hungry for more, and in that hunger, Napoleon made the most fatal decision of his life: to invade Russia, a land vast, mysterious, and cold, ruled by the cunning and cautious Tsar Alexander I, once ally, now subtle enemy. The reason, on paper, was political: Russia's refusal to honor the continental system, Napoleon's economic blockade against Britain. But beneath that reason lay obsession, pride, and the belief that his will could command not just armies, but landscapes, seasons, and fate itself. In the summer of 1812, the Grande Armée, a monstrous force of over 600,000 men, a mosaic of nations conscripted under French command, began its eastward march. It was less a campaign than an avalanche: cavalry, infantry, cannon, supply wagons, uniforms of every color and flag, and yet behind all the grandeur lurked an unthinkable flaw. They were prepared for war, but not for Russia. As they crossed the Niemen River, Russia did not rise to meet them. It retreated. City by city, village by village, the Russians fell back, burning their own lands, fields, and homes behind them in a scorched earth retreat, turning each step of Napoleon's progress into a hollow, exhausting nightmare. The sun baked the soldiers by day, and the nights chilled them. Supplies ran low. Discipline began to fray. But still, Napoleon pressed on, convinced that a single great battle, like Austerlitz, like Marengo, would break the Tsar's will. That battle came at Borodino, on September 7th, a day drenched in smoke and slaughter. It was a brutal, near-suicidal engagement, with no real tactical brilliance, only relentless force. Over 70,000 men were killed or wounded in a single day, and when the cannons finally went silent, the Russians had retreated, but not broken. The path to Moscow lay open, and Napoleon entered the ancient city in grim silence, expecting emissaries, surrender, a throne to sit on. Instead, he found Moscow empty, abandoned by its people, and then, on the third night, on fire. Russian saboteurs had torched their own city rather than let Napoleon claim it. The flames devoured palaces, markets, churches. The emperor stood at the heart of a burning ghost town, not as a conqueror, but as a man surrounded by ash and cold. Days turned to weeks. No message came from the Tsar. No surrender. No peace. Just snow, falling earlier than expected, an omen. On October 19th, with winter sharpening its fangs, Napoleon gave the order to retreat. What followed was not a march, but a catastrophe unlike anything Europe had ever seen. The Russian winter, that ancient monster, descended with merciless fury. Temperatures plummeted. Horses froze mid-step. Men marched without shoes, without food, their uniforms turning to ice. The starving Grande Armée, harassed by Cossacks, plagued by frostbite and disease, collapsed in on itself. Men turned to madness. Cannons were abandoned. Wounds went untreated. The dead became landmarks. What began as the largest military force ever assembled ended with fewer than 100,000 men straggling back across the border, and among them, Napoleon, no longer the invincible eagle of Europe, but a silent man whose shadow had been carved by loss. But war has no mercy for pause, and while France reeled from the disaster, Napoleon's enemies, once defeated, humiliated, saw their chance. Prussia, Austria, Britain, Russia. They rose again, blood stirring beneath old scars, forming the Sixth Coalition, determined to bury the empire for good. Napoleon, resilient as ever, rallied fresh troops, raised new armies, and fought with ferocity in 1813, delivering one last display of genius at Dresden. But the numbers were no longer in his favor. His marshals were tired. His alliances were brittle. His empire, built on conquest, began to crack at its very core. Germany stirred with rebellion. Italy whispered of independence. In Spain, the ulcer still bled. By the end of 1813, at the Battle of Leipzig, the Battle of Nations, Napoleon was overwhelmed. Over 500,000 troops from 4 empires crushed his forces in a 3-day storm of blood. It was not just a defeat, it was a reckoning. He fled back to France, haunted by the echo of cheers that had turned into silence. Paris itself trembled. The myth was broken. The emperor, who once crowned himself, now fought on his own soil, retreating deeper into a shrinking circle of loyalty. And yet, even as enemies closed in, he fought like a lion in a burning cage. In 1814, outnumbered, betrayed, abandoned by allies and even his own Senate, Napoleon still delivered brilliant battles, Champaubert, Montmirail, Montereau, victories that would have been immortal in any other war. But it was too late. The world no longer feared him, it had grown tired of him. On March 31st, 1814, Paris fell. Napoleon's capital, the heart of his empire, surrendered while he was still fighting on the front. His marshals begged him to abdicate. The people turned away. The spell had broken. And on April 6, 1814, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, General of the Revolution, dreamer of empire, signed his abdication. He was allowed to live, a rare mercy for a fallen titan, and was exiled to the tiny island of Elba, given a small guard and a hollow title. As he boarded the ship that would carry him away from France, Napoleon turned to gaze one last time at the country he had once bent to his will, the nation he loved more than life, and the people who now belonged to history more than to him. He had risen from nothing, shaken the world, crowned himself with glory, and now, shattered by winter and war, he left not in chains, but in silence. The eagle had not fallen in battle. He had fallen under the weight of the very sky he once ruled. In the early light of February 26, 1815, as waves licked the shores of Elba and Europe breathed in what it thought was peace, Napoleon Bonaparte, stripped of empire, abandoned by kings and comrades, boarded a small brig named Inconstant with fewer than 1,000 loyal men and an unthinkable dream, to return to France, not as a ghost, but as a flame reborn. For 10 months, he had paced that island like a lion in a cage, ruling it with uneasy dignity, haunted by letters from the mainland, whispers of Bourbon weakness, and the aching knowledge that history was still breathing inside him. Europe had tried to forget him, to bury his legend under treaties and kings and golden thrones restored, but Napoleon could not forget who he was. He landed on the shores of southern France like a storm without thunder, and as he marched north, alone, with no army, no banners, only memory and myth, the impossible began. Soldiers sent to arrest him dropped their weapons and wept. Peasants cheered. Veterans knelt. And by the time he reached Lyon, the army meant to stop him had joined him, and the road to Paris cracked open not with war, but with awe. Louis XVIII fled, and on March 20th, 1815, less than a month after setting sail, Napoleon stood once more in the Tuileries Palace, not as a fugitive, but as Emperor of the French. These were the 100 Days, a brief, blazing resurrection, as Napoleon rushed to rebuild an empire from memory and ashes, writing decrees by candlelight, rekindling alliances, raising armies, trying to bind France together before Europe could react. But Europe had not forgiven him. They had only paused. Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia, they moved like wolves stirred from sleep. Napoleon, aware of their speed and strength, knew he had one chance: strike first, strike fast, and force a decisive victory before the jaws closed. And so in June of 1815, he marched once more toward destiny, not as the unshakable emperor of Austerlitz, but as a man battling time itself. He faced old enemies, and old friends turned cold. At Ligny, he crushed the Prussians under Blücher, but failed to destroy them. At Quatre-Bras, his marshals hesitated, lost hours, lost ground. But it was at Waterloo, on June 18th, under dark clouds and sodden fields, that fate delivered its final, ruthless verdict. Napoleon arrived confident, even poetic, believing he could break the British lines under Wellington before the Prussians could arrive. His troops fought with fury, his cannons roared, and at times the field seemed on the verge of bending to his will. But delays, mud, miscalculations, and the stubborn steel of British squares held the tide. And when the Prussians arrived, like a ghost Napoleon thought vanquished, the field tipped. He sent in the Imperial Guard, his last reserve, his legend in human form, but even they, those immortal veterans, were repelled, broke formation, and whispered to the world what it had never dared hear. La Garde recule. The Guard retreats. It was over. Napoleon fled the field not in triumph, but in shadow, surrounded by the dead, pursued by vengeance. Paris turned cold. His ministers evaporated. His friends begged him to abdicate again, and he did, not in the marble halls of victory, but in a quiet room, with ink on his fingers and nothing left to save. He hoped to escape to America, to disappear across the ocean like a forgotten god, but the British caught him. This time, there would be no Elba, no crown, no second return. They sent him to St. Helena, a lonely rock in the South Atlantic, surrounded by empty sea, guarded by ships and silence. There, stripped of everything but breath and memory, Napoleon lived the last years of his life not as a general, not as an emperor, but as a man remembering battles aloud to the waves. He dictated his memoirs, argued with his captors, walked the barren landscape like a ghost caught between greatness and grief. He spoke often of glory, of betrayal, of fate. His body withered, his mind burned. On May 5th, 1821, after years of exile, sickness, and isolation, Napoleon Bonaparte, the boy from Corsica, the architect of empires, the crowned rebel, the shadow emperor, closed his eyes for the final time. No trumpets played, no eagle flew, but somewhere in the silence, the world trembled just a little, because the man who had once rewritten time had finally run out of it. Long after his heart stopped beating on the lonely rock of St. Helena, long after the cannons fell quiet and the eagles were caged, the name Napoleon Bonaparte did not vanish into the shadows of history. It grew louder, stranger, and more immortal than any crown he had ever worn. He had died as a prisoner of the world he once ruled, but in death, something almost divine began to stir. An idea, a myth, a memory too large to bury beneath stone. His enemies wrote books to condemn him, yet with every word, they built his monument higher. Mothers whispered his name to sons as a symbol of power and punishment. Revolutionaries studied his rise with trembling hope. Monarchs, who once spat at his audacity, later mimicked his laws, his systems, his very silhouette. His body lay in exile, but his legend returned to France long before his ashes did. In 1840, nearly 2 decades after his final breath, His remains were brought back in a golden coffin, floating down the Seine as thousands wept and sang, not for the man he became, but for the boy who once dared everything. They buried him beneath the golden dome of Les Invalides, not as a defeated exile, but as an emperor reborn in death. And so the myth continued, not frozen in fact, but carried in the trembling voices of poets, in the bitter ink of historians, in the silent awe of soldiers staring at his tomb. Some called him a tyrant, a butcher, a soul who betrayed liberty for glory. Others called him a genius, a phoenix, the living symbol of merit over blood. But no one, not even his most vicious enemy, could ignore him. He had reshaped Europe, not just with swords, but with laws, with vision, with sheer force of belief. He had crowned himself in defiance of gods and kings, and when he fell, the world looked smaller without him. Even now, centuries later, his name stirs debates, inspires films, fills libraries. Here remains a question carved into history's heart. What happens when one man dares to defy the entire world and almost wins? In every fallen empire, in every rebel speech, in every whisper of revolution, his shadow lingers, not as flesh, not as emperor, but as echo. And so, the story of Napoleon Bonaparte, from a Corsican boy with fire in his eyes to the emperor who bent the world to his will, comes to an end. But legends like his never truly die, they echo. Through blood, betrayal, brilliance, and downfall, Napoleon left behind not just an empire, but a question etched across time. What would you sacrifice to shape the world? If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you see history with new eyes, don't forget to like, share, and leave your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear what this legend meant to you. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon, because there are many more powerful stories waiting in the shadows of history. Thank you for watching. This was From Son to Sovereign, the Napoleon Bonaparte saga. We'll see you in the next legend.